The office smelled of polished oak and old authority. On the desk lay a checkbook, its leather cover worn soft at the edges by the hands of men accustomed to settling matters with signatures rather than arguments. Through the window, the floodlights of Elland Road stood like steel sentinels against the grey September sky, and somewhere below, on the car park tarmac, a cluster of journalists stamped their feet and waited for the man they had come to watch fall. It was the 12th of September, 1974. Brian Clough, 39 years old, sat across from the Leeds United chairman and listened to the figure being offered. £98,000. Compensation, they called it. Hush money, he knew it to be. 44 days earlier, he had walked into this building as the new manager of the reigning champions of England. 44 days. One victory from 6 matches. A dressing room that despised him, a boardroom that feared him, and now a cheque. He took it. He was no fool. Minutes later, he appeared on the car park steps. The reporters surged forward. Microphones jabbed at the air like lances. Cameras whirred. "Gentlemen," he said, and his voice carried that familiar Middlesbrough cadence, soft and sharp all at once, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "I've just been relieved of my duties. They've offered me £98,000 and I've accepted, because unlike the people who run this football club, I know the value of money." A pause, a half-smile. "I remain the best manager in the country. They know it. You know it. And if you don't, you haven't been paying attention." He turned and walked to his car. Nobody followed. The door closed. The engine started. And Brian Clough drove away from the most spectacular failure of his career, leaving behind a question that would take decades to answer, and that, in truth, has never been answered at all. What makes a person of proven genius accept a position in which he is destined to fail? What drives a manager who has already won the First Division championship with an unfashionable provincial club to take charge of a team whose players he has publicly insulted for years? Was it vanity? Was it recklessness? Or was it something far older, far deeper? A need that had nothing to do with football and everything to do with a terraced house on Valley Road, and a boy who had been told, at the age of 11, that he was not good enough. To understand that September afternoon in Leeds, we must travel back nearly 4 decades, to the industrial northeast of England, to a town built on steel and smoke and stubborn pride, and to a family of 11 pressed into a house that could barely hold 6. Valley Road, number 11, Grove Hill, Middlesbrough. On the 21st of March, 1935, a boy was born into a household already overflowing with children. His father, Joseph Clough, worked at Garnett's sweet factory, a quiet, steady man who came home each evening smelling of sugar and exhaustion. His mother, Sarah, known to all as Sally, ran the house with fierce efficiency and fiercer ambition. 9 children, 8 boys and 1 girl. The rooms were small. The meals were plain. The walls were thin enough to hear every argument, every laugh, every silence. Middlesbrough in the 30s was a town shaped by its industry. The steel works lined the river, belching smoke into skies that never quite cleared. The people who walked those narrow streets understood, without ever being told, that life was a matter of endurance rather than adventure. You were born, you worked, you died. And if you were lucky, you found a Saturday afternoon's escape at Ayerson Park, watching men in muddy shirts chase a leather ball across a pitch that turned to soup by October. The Clough children, by all accounts, were bright. Sally made certain of that. Education was her weapon against the world that wanted her sons in the factories and her daughter in the kitchen. One by one, the children sat the 11+ examination, the test that in post-war England divided children as cleanly as a butcher's knife divided meat. Pass, and you went to grammar school, and from grammar school to a white-collar life. Fail, and you went to secondary modern, and from secondary modern to the factory floor, the building site, the dole queue. 8 of Sally's 9 children passed. Gerald passed. Bill passed. Des passed. Every last one of them passed, except Brian. One can only imagine the evening that news arrived at Valley Road. The other results already pinned to the kitchen wall, perhaps, or spoken of with quiet satisfaction over tea. And then the youngest boy's letter, the wrong letter, the short letter, the one that said, in the polite, bloodless language of the education authorities, that Brian Clough would not be joining his brothers at grammar school. What did Sally say? We do not know. What did the boy feel, standing in that kitchen, surrounded by siblings who had succeeded where he had not? We can guess. Years later, in interview after interview, in books and television studios, Clough would return to this moment like a tongue returning to a broken tooth. He once said that his championship medals were his O-levels and A-levels. The qualifications, the examination system had denied him. He spoke of his mother with a love that was edged, always with something harder. He believed, or needed to believe, that she favoured his brother Bill. Whether this was true or merely the story a wounded child tells himself in order to make sense of his wound, nobody can say with certainty. But the feeling was real. The scar was permanent. And everything that Brian Clough became, the brilliance, the arrogance, the cruelty, the extraordinary tenderness, grew, in some measure, from that kitchen on Valley Road, and the boy who was told he was not clever enough. He was clever, of course, ferociously so. But his intelligence expressed itself not through examinations and essays, but through his mouth and his feet. The mouth would come to define him. The feet came first. He loved cricket more than football, at least in the beginning, a fact that surprises those who know only the legend. He was a decent batsman with an eye for the ball and a temperament that bordered on the confrontational. Years later, he would form a friendship with Geoffrey Boycott, another Yorkshireman of granite self-belief, and the two of them would argue about batting technique with the ferocity lesser men reserved for politics. "I'd rather have 100 years at Lord's than a hat-trick at Wembley," he once remarked, and those who knew him best suspected he was not entirely joking. But cricket, in Middlesbrough in the 1950s, did not pay. Football did, and Brian Clough could play football in a way that made people who understood the game catch their breath. He signed for Middlesbrough Football Club as a young professional, and from the first training session, it was apparent that he possessed something beyond talent, an almost pathological desire to score goals. He was not the strongest player on the pitch. He was not the fastest, nor the most elegant. But he had an instinct for the position of the ball that bordered on clairvoyance, and a hunger for the net that was closer to obsession than ambition. The numbers tell the story more eloquently than any adjective. 251 goals in 274 appearances, across his time at Middlesbrough and later at Sunderland. Nearly a goal a game. In the era of heavy leather balls, bone-hard pitches, and defenders who regarded a forward's ankles as legitimate targets, it was extraordinary. Picture one of those goals. A grey afternoon at Ayresome Park. The crowd pressed tight along the terraces. cigarette smoke rising in the cold air like incense in a cathedral of the working class. The ball arrives from the right, a hopeful cross, not perfectly struck. Most forwards would let it pass or chest it down and look for options. Clough does neither. In the fraction of a second between the ball's arrival and its departure, he adjusts his body, shifts his weight, and strikes. Not with power, with precision. The ball travels low and fast, past the goalkeeper's outstretched hand, into the corner of the net. He turns away before it arrives. He already knows. This is what genius looks like when it wears muddy boots and a number 9 shirt. England noticed. The selectors called him up. He played 2 matches for his country, scored 2 goals, the kind of conversion rate that ought to have guaranteed a long international career, and was never selected again. The reasons were murky then, and remain contentious now. Some suggested that the selectors found him difficult. Others hinted at personality clashes. The truth, most likely, is simpler and sadder. Brian Clough, even in his early 20s, could not stop saying what he thought, and the men who ran English football in the 50s were not accustomed to being told they were wrong by a lad from a terraced house in Grove Hill. It was during these years, years of goals and growing fame, of Saturday afternoons that felt like validation and Monday mornings that felt like hunger, that he met the woman who would become his anchor, his counterweight, and the quiet center of a life that was, in every other respect, magnificently loud. Barbara Glasgow was not interested in football. She was interested in ballet, in opera, in the music of Tchaikovsky and the novels of the Brontes. She came from Middlesbrough as he did, but she inhabited a different world within the same grey streets, a world of concert programs and library books, of culture pursued quietly and without apology. When they met, in the late 50s, the contrast must have been almost comical. The brash young striker, all swagger and opinions, and the composed young woman who could not have cared less about his goals per game ratio. He tried to impress her naturally. He talked about his prospects, his ambitions, the goals he had scored and the goals he intended to score. She listened politely, smiled, and changed the subject to something that interested her. It was, by all accounts, the most effective defensive performance he ever encountered. And unlike most defences, this one made him want to come back for more. They married on the 4th of April, 1959, at St. Barnabas Church in Middlesbrough. He was 24. She was barely into her 20s. The photographs show a young couple squinting into the spring light outside the church door. He in a suit that sits slightly too wide on his narrow shoulders. She with a bouquet and a smile that he would later describe, with uncharacteristic tenderness, as being the size of Stockton High Street. When asked, years afterwards, what the best decision of his life had been, he did not mention the signing of a particular player or the tactical adjustment that won a particular match. The best thing I ever did, he said simply, was marry Barbara. And for the next 45 years, through triumph and catastrophe, through fame and disgrace, through bottles emptied and medals won and friendships destroyed, she would remain beside him, not because he always deserved it, but because that was how she understood love. Quiet, daily, patient. The opposite of everything he was in public. The thing that kept him, if not whole, then at least in one piece, but all of that lay ahead. In the spring of 59, they were simply a young couple starting a life, and the future was a field of possibility stretching out in every direction, green and inviting and limitless. The goals continued. He moved from Middlesbrough to Sunderland in 1961, and the scoring did not stop. The crowds at Roker Park, Sunderland's home ground, learned to expect what the crowds at Elland Park had already known, that when the ball found its way to Clough, something was about to happen. And then came Boxing Day, the 26th of December, 1962. Roker Park, Sunderland against Bury. The pitch was iron hard with frost, the kind of surface that punished every fall and forgave nothing. Nobody who walked through the turnstiles that afternoon expected to witness anything of consequence. Certainly nobody expected to witness the end of a career and the beginning of everything that followed. The ball came through. Clough went for it. So did the Bury goalkeeper, Chris Harker. They arrived at the same moment. The collision was brutal, graceless, a dull, heavy thud followed by something sharper, something that those nearest the touchline would later describe as a crack. He lay on the frozen ground. The stadium fell quiet, the way stadiums do when they sense that what they are watching has crossed the boundary from sport into something else. The stretcher came. The crowd watched. And Clough, 27 years old, was carried from the pitch at Roker Park with his right knee destroyed, the anterior cruciate ligaments torn beyond the repair that 1960s medicine could offer. In the hospital, the words came from the surgeon with the careful neutrality that medical professionals reserve for news they know will not be welcomed. "Will I play again?" Silence, a beat too long. "We'll do everything we can." Which was not an answer, and both of them knew it. He did try to come back 3 agonizing appearances in the 64-65 season, the knee buckling with each turn, each sprint, each reminder that the body he had trusted absolutely had betrayed him. By the time he accepted the truth, he was 29 years old. The career was over. 251 goals, 2 England caps, and a right knee that would ache in the rain for the rest of his life. Sunderland handled the matter with the brisk efficiency of an institution disposing of damaged goods. There were consultations and insurance forms, sympathetic letters and firm handshakes, and beneath it all the unmistakable message that the striker who had filled these terraces week after week, who had scored goal after goal, justifying every ticket price, was now a liability to be written off rather than an asset to be preserved. The insurance payout was processed. The books were balanced. And the young man with the ruined knee was left to find his own way forward, carrying with him a bitterness towards Sunderland that would never fully heal, much like the knee itself. Barbara watched. She had been married to him for 3.5 years. There were no children yet. In those early months after the injury, it was just the two of them, a young wife and a young husband who had lost the single thing that gave his life its shape and meaning. Before Boxing Day, he had been virtually teetotal. This detail, confirmed by those who knew him in his playing days and corroborated decades later by his son Nigel, is essential to understanding what followed. The athlete's body had been his instrument, and he had treated it with the respect a musician affords a Stradivarius. He did not drink because drinking would have dulled the reflexes, slowed the feet, clouded the instinct that told him where the ball would be before it arrived. But now the instrument was broken. The reflexes were irrelevant. The feet had nowhere to go. The drinking began slowly. A pint after a long afternoon of nothing. A whiskey to take the edge off an evening that stretched out like a sentence without punctuation. It was not yet a problem. It was not yet visible. It was merely a new habit forming in the space where an old purpose used to live, the way water fills a hole in the ground, gradually, silently, until one day you look down and realize you are standing in a pond. Nobody intervened. Nobody could have. In the working class northeast of the 60s, a man's drinking was his own business, and a wife's role was to put the kettle on and say nothing. Barbara said nothing. She put the kettle on, and she waited for whatever would come next. What happens to a predator when its legs are broken? It does not stop being a predator. It finds another way to hunt. What came next arrived in 1965 in the unlikely form of Hartlepool's United, the smallest, poorest, most obscure outfit in the Football League. They needed a manager. Brian Clough, 30 years old, with no managerial experience whatsoever, walked into their cramped little office and announced that he was the answer. He was hired, one suspect, less because of any coherent plan he presented than because of the sheer, bewildering force of his conviction. He believed he could manage a football club. He believed it so completely, so luminously, that it did not occur to anyone to suggest he might be wrong. And he brought someone with him. Peter Taylor, a former goalkeeper of modest ability and immodest intelligence, whose gift was not for playing the game, but for seeing it. Taylor could watch a reserve team match in the Welsh leagues and spot, among 22 unremarkable players, the one who had something, a first touch, a positional awareness, a temperament that could be cultivated into quality. If Clough was the voice, Taylor was the eyes. They were two halves of a single footballing brain, and apart, neither would ever quite function at full capacity. "I've found a left-back," Taylor said one morning, dropping a scrap of paper on the desk. "Where?" "Workington. He's raw, he's cheap, and he doesn't know how good he is yet." "Then sign him before he finds out." This was the rhythm of their partnership. Taylor delivering the intelligence, Clough making the decision, both moving at a speed that left chairmen breathless and rivals baffled. It was instinctive, complementary, and for nearly 2 decades, almost unfailingly correct. At Hartlepool's, they performed miracles of a modest kind. The side had no money, no facilities, no reputation. The manager responded by doing everything himself. He obtained a public service vehicle license so that he could personally drive the team coach to away fixtures, an actual bus license, because hiring a driver was an expense the club could not afford. Picture it, a future European Cup winner, hunched behind the wheel of a rattling coach on the A roads of northern England, his players dozing in the seats behind him, the rain drumming on the windscreen, the destination some windswept ground in Barrow or Stockport, where 300 spectators would stand in the cold and watch football that nobody outside the town would ever hear about. This was where it started. This was the foundation. He drove to pubs across the town, collecting donations from landlords and drinkers. One publican laughed in his face. Clough stared at him for a long moment, the same stare that would later reduce international footballers to silence, and said, quite calmly, that the man's pub served the worst beer in the northeast, and he would make sure the entire town knew it. The donation appeared the following morning. Nobody laughed at him twice. He reorganized the training ground. He reorganized the canteen. When the women who served meals in the club kitchen laughed after a defeat, he sacked them on the spot. This was not cruelty for its own sake. This was a man who could not tolerate any environment in which losing was treated as acceptable, in which mediocrity was met with a shrug rather than a snarl. Together, he and Taylor lifted Hartlepool's from the foot of the 4th Division to something approaching respectability. It was not glamorous, but it was proof that the method worked, proof that the voice and the eyes, operating in concert, could transform a football club from the inside out. In 1967, Derby County came calling. A 2nd Division side with faded ambitions and a boardroom that had grown comfortable with underachievement. Clough and Taylor arrived like a weather system, sudden, disruptive, impossible to ignore. The new boss demanded total control, over transfers, over tactics, over the colour of the paint in the dressing room. The board, bewildered by his certainty, gave him what he wanted. Within 2 years, Derby were champions of the 2nd Division. Within 5, they were champions of England. Let that settle for a moment. Champions of England, a provincial club from the East Midlands, drifting for years through the lower reaches of the top flight, suddenly and astonishingly sitting at the summit of English football. The year was 1972. The manager was 37 years old. The boy who had failed the 11+ examination had just passed the only test that mattered to him. Television discovered him during these years, and the love affair was instant. The cameras adored his face, angular, expressive, capable of shifting from warmth to menace in the space of a syllable. His wit was lacerating and perfectly timed. "They say Rome wasn't built in a day," he told an interviewer, leaning back with the easy confidence of a man who knows exactly how good he is. "But I wasn't on that particular job." The nation laughed. The football establishment winced. And Brian Clough became something that English football had never quite produced before. A manager who was more famous than his players, more entertaining than the matches, more quotable than the politicians who occasionally attempted to use football for their own purposes. At home in Derby, the family was growing. Simon had arrived on the 15th of June, 1964, a first child, born into the uncertainty of the post-injury years. Nigel followed on the 19th of March, 1966, the boy who would carry his father's profession, if not his father's temperament, into the next generation. And Elizabeth, called Libby by the family, completed the trio on the 31st of May, 1967. Barbara raised them. There is no more accurate or more inadequate way to put it. While her husband built his empire, while he bullied directors and charmed journalists, and drove to training grounds at dawn, and returned home long after the children were asleep, she raised 3 children in the quiet, competent, invisible manner of a woman whose contribution would never make the back pages. She took them to ballet classes and concerts. She maintained, within the 4 walls of their home, a world that had nothing to do with league tables and transfer fees. It was her sanctuary, and she defended it with a determination that matched, in its own way, anything her husband achieved on the touchline. The glory at Derby could not last, because Brian Clough could not stop being Brian Clough. In October of 1973, he quarrelled with the chairman, Sam Longson, over the board's interference in football matters, which is to say, over their failure to understand that football matters were his business and his alone. He and Taylor resigned in protest. The cameras captured him leaving the ground, turning to face the lens, and thrusting 2 fingers into the air with the cheerful defiance of a man who would rather burn a bridge than cross it on someone else's terms. The supporters took to the streets. "Clough out, we're out," read the placards. For a few remarkable days, it seemed as though the entire town might grind to a halt, but boards do not reverse decisions under pressure from crowds, and crowds eventually go home. The moment passed. He went to Brighton on the south coast, as far from Derby, culturally and geographically, as it was possible to go while remaining in England. He arrived in November of 73 and stayed until July of 74. He improved the team. He raised their position. But his heart was not in it, and everyone could tell. Brighton was a way station, not a destination. He was waiting for something bigger. It arrived wearing the white shirt of Leeds United. Leeds, under Don Revie, had been the dominant force in English football for a decade. Their players, Bremner, Giles, Charlton, Hunter, were household names, revered by their own supporters and loathed with varying degrees of intensity by everyone else. Revie's Leeds were brilliant and brutal, effective and cynical, champions and villains in equal measure. And Brian Clough had spent the best part of 5 years saying so in public, in the most colourful terms available to him. Why, then, did he accept the Leeds job? Perhaps it was pride, the need to prove that he could succeed anywhere, even in hostile territory. Perhaps it was desperation. The Brighton experiment had been a dead end, and the footballing world was beginning to wonder whether Derby had been a fluke. Perhaps it was something deeper still. The old, unhealed need to walk into a room where he was not wanted and make them want him. He walked into the Leeds dressing room on the 30th of July, 1974. The players, men who had won everything, who had been told for years that they were the finest in England, sat and watched him with the cold, evaluating eyes of professionals who have already decided that this new arrival will not last. What he said next has been reconstructed from multiple accounts, each slightly different in wording but identical in spirit. He looked at their championship medals, their international caps, their years of service under Revie, and he told them, "You can throw all your medals in the bin because you won them all by cheating." The room fell silent, not agreement, not shock, something colder, the collective decision of proud, hard, experienced men who have just been insulted by a stranger and who have resolved, without discussion, that this stranger will be destroyed. 44 days. That is all it lasted. From the 30th of July to the 12th of September. 1 victory. 5 defeats and draws that felt like defeats. Training sessions attended by players who followed instructions with the mechanical compliance of men awaiting an execution. Team talks delivered to faces that had gone carefully, deliberately blank. At home, Barbara saw the deterioration. She had not wanted the move. She had known, in the way that wives know things they cannot prove and husbands refuse to hear, that Leeds was wrong. Wrong club, wrong city, wrong moment. Every evening he came through the door looking older than he had looked that morning. After the sacking, a television confrontation with Don Revie became one of the defining images of the era. The broadcast was staged by a program maker with an instinct for theatre. 2 men who despised each other, seated in armchairs under studio lights, smiling through clenched teeth while a presenter lobbed questions between them like grenades. Clough was charming and lethal. Revie was stiff and defensive. The audience watched, fascinated, as 2 visions of football collided in the genteel arena of a television studio. None of it changed the outcome. On the 12th of September, the board had offered him £98,000 to go away. He took the money because he was a pragmatist beneath the bravado. He walked out of Elland Road, past the journalists on the car park steps, and delivered the performance we began with: the calm, the half-smile, the quiet insistence that he remained the finest manager in England regardless of what had just occurred. The car pulled away. Leeds receded in the rear-view mirror. And Brian Clough, for the second time in his life, found himself staring at a future that had suddenly, violently contracted. The boy expelled from the examination hall, the striker carried from the frozen pitch, the manager escorted from the building. 3 rejections, each one shaping him further, each one driving the nail of self-belief deeper into the wood of his character. He was 39 years old. He had a wife and 3 children and £98,000, and a reputation for brilliance that was now thoroughly entangled with a reputation for chaos. Nobody in English football knew quite what to do with him. The clubs that admired his talent feared his temperament. The boardrooms that might have hired him remembered what had happened at Derby and at Leeds and decided that the risk outweighed the reward. For 4 months there was silence. The telephone did not ring. The offers did not come. Once he had been everywhere, every screen, every front page, every argument. Now he was nowhere. Barbara made tea. The children went to school. The rain fell on the East Midlands. And somewhere in a house that felt too quiet and too small, Brian Clough waited for the call that would give him one more chance. It came in January of 1975. The club was Nottingham Forest, 2nd Division, unremarkable in every measurable way. A ground called the City Ground that sat on the banks of the River Trent and held the modest ghosts of modest achievements. Nobody, not the board who hired him, not the players who shook his hand, not the journalists who noted the appointment in a single paragraph on the inside pages, nobody could have foreseen what was about to happen. 2 European Cups, back to back, won by a side that 3 years before the first of them had been playing in the 2nd Division. This is not a statistic. This is an act of defiance against the natural order of the game. A parish church choir walking onto the stage at La Scala and singing the house down. But the choir needed assembling. Taylor, reunited with his partner, scoured the lower divisions, the reserve leagues, the overlooked and undervalued corners of English football. John Robertson, a winger languishing in Forest's reserves, overweight and underappreciated, was reinvented as one of the most devastating attacking players in the country. Kenny Burns, a striker with a reputation for violence that exceeded his reputation for goals, was converted into a centre-half of commanding authority. Peter Shilton, already one of England's finest goalkeepers, was persuaded that his future lay at the City Ground rather than at a more fashionable address. One by one, Taylor identified them. One by one, Clough made them believe they were capable of things they had never imagined. Promotion came in 77. The First Division Championship followed in 78, the season immediately after promotion, a feat so improbable that it bears comparison with the great fairy tales of sporting history. Forest, newly arrived among the elite, simply walked past them all. Liverpool, the reigning European champions, Everton, Arsenal, Manchester United. They finished above every one of them, and they did so playing football that was not merely effective but beautiful, precise, attacking, built on the principle that the ball should do the work and the players should have the intelligence to let it. Then came Europe, the greatest tournament in club football. Win or go home. No second chances. Forest entered the European Cup in the autumn of 1978. and from the first round it was clear that something extraordinary was unfolding. They beat Liverpool, the holders, in the opening round. They beat AEK Athens, then Grasshoppers of Zurich, then FC Köln. Each victory was achieved with a composure that belied the squad's relative inexperience, as though these players had been doing this for years rather than months. The final was held on the 30th of May, 1979, at the Olympia Stadion in Munich. Nottingham Forest against Malmö of Sweden. 60,000 spectators in a stadium built for the '72 Olympics, its sweeping canopy casting geometric shadows across the pitch. Forest supporters had travelled in their thousands, bus drivers and factory workers and school teachers and shop assistants, people who a few years earlier had been watching second division football on wet Saturday afternoons, now sitting in a German stadium watching their team contest the greatest prize in the club game. The goal came in the second half. Robertson, the winger Taylor had rescued from obscurity, received the ball on the left and delivered a cross of exquisite precision. Trevor Francis, the first £1 million player in the history of English football, signed by Clough for that exact sum, met it with his head and guided it past the goalkeeper. 1-0. Forest held on. The final whistle blew, and the manager, sitting on the bench in his green sweatshirt, permitted himself a smile that contained, if one looked closely, not merely satisfaction, but something closer to vindication. There is a detail about Francis worth preserving. He had been ineligible for the earlier rounds due to the timing of his registration. He played only in the final. One match, one goal. The most expensive player in the country, deployed with the precision of a surgeon using a scalpel exactly once, at the exact moment it was needed. This was Clough's genius in miniature, knowing not just what to do, but when. The following year they did it again. The final was in Madrid, the Santiago Bernabeu, Cathedral of Real Madrid, a ground that had witnessed more triumphs in this competition than any other venue on earth. Forest against Hamburg of West Germany. Kevin Keegan, the European Footballer of the Year, leading the German side. The weight of expectation, of history, of probability, all pressing down upon the shoulders of a team from an English provincial city that most Europeans could not locate on a map. Robertson scored. A goal of almost insolent simplicity, a low, firm strike from the edge of the area that passed through a thicket of defenders and nestled in the corner of the net as though it had always been destined to arrive there. 1-0. Again. Forest held on. Again. And when the final whistle sounded in the warm Madrid evening, Brian Clough had achieved something that no English manager had achieved before or has achieved since. Consecutive continental titles with the same club. Not Liverpool. Not Manchester United. Not Arsenal or Tottenham or any of the grand, wealthy, historically gilded institutions of English football. Nottingham Forest. A side whose budget was a fraction of its rivals, whose stadium was modest, whose city was famous for lace and for Robin Hood, and now for this. The house in Quandon told the story of what success meant in domestic terms. It was a comfortable home in a leafy suburb of Derby. Not grand, not ostentatious, but undeniably middle class, with a green lawn and a driveway and the kind of quiet respectability that would have seemed unimaginable to the boy from Valley Road. For Sally Clough's youngest son, raised in a terraced house with 8 siblings and a shared outdoor lavatory, This lawn, this driveway, this silence was the physical proof that he had escaped, that the examination system had been wrong, that the world which had stamped him as secondary modern material had been forced to revise its assessment. It was during the mid-80s, at the height of Forest's powers, that something happened which reveals a dimension of Brian Clough that the footballing narrative too often obscures. Two boys appeared, brothers, from Sunderland, the city where his playing career had ended in pain and bitterness. Craig and Aaron Bromfield. They were destitute, they were young, they were sleeping in doorways, surviving on the uncertain charity of strangers. Clough noticed them. "Where do you live?" he asked. "Nowhere," they said. "Get in the car." That was it. No speeches, no grand gestures, no cameras summoned to record the moment. Just a car door opening, two boys climbing in, and a drive to a house where there was food on the table, and a bed with clean sheets, and an adult who looked at them and saw not a problem to be managed, but children to be raised. Craig, the elder, was 16 when he moved in. He lived with the Clough family for 4 years. It was not a formal adoption. The paperwork of officialdom was never Clough's style. It was something simpler, and in its way more profound. A man seeing two children in need and deciding, without committee or consultation, that he would meet that need himself. This is one of the contradictions that sits at the heart of Brian Clough's life, and it must be stated plainly, because the temptation to resolve it is strong and must be resisted. The hands that would later strike his own supporters across the face are the same hands that opened a car door for two starving boys from Sunderland. He was not two people. He was one, and that one person contained all of it, the tenderness and the violence, the generosity and the cruelty, the love and the rage. To simplify him is to lose him. His politics were of a piece with this complexity. He was a socialist, genuinely, vocally, unapologetically. When the miners went on strike in 1984, he supported them. Not with vague words of sympathy from a safe distance, but with money, donations to the National Union of Mine Workers, from his own pocket, at a time when supporting the miners was a declaration of war against the government of Margaret Thatcher. He believed in the National Health Service, in state education, in the redistribution of wealth from those who had too much to those who had too little. He said so publicly, repeatedly, and with a directness that made the football authorities uncomfortable and the Labour Party hopeful. Labour approached him about standing for Parliament. He declined. One suspects that the prospect of submitting to party discipline, of being told what to say, when to say it, and to whom, was as appealing to Brian Clough as a vow of silence would have been to a songbird. There was a contradiction here, too, and he knew it. The socialist who lived in a suburban house with a green lawn. The champion of the working class who had, by any material measure, left the working class behind. He carried this tension within him like a stone in his shoe, uncomfortable, persistent, impossible to ignore, but equally impossible to remove without stopping the journey altogether. And through all of it, the trophies, the Bromfield boys, the political convictions, the television appearances, there was Peter Taylor. Until, suddenly, there was not. The rupture came in 1983, and it came not with the dramatic crash of a public confrontation, but with the slow, sick crack of a relationship that had been bearing too much weight for too long. Taylor signed a player without consulting Clough. He also requested a salary increase, which the manager interpreted not as a professional negotiation, but as a personal betrayal. In the world of Brian Clough, where loyalty was the supreme virtue and disloyalty the unpardonable sin, these two offences were indistinguishable. They were both acts of treachery. He called Taylor a snake in the grass. The phrase was delivered publicly, and it landed with the precision and devastation of a well-aimed penalty. It could not be taken back. It was not meant to be taken back, but the wound was mutual. Taylor was not merely an assistant. He was the only human being in the world, apart from Barbara, with whom Brian Clough could be vulnerable. The only person who could say you are wrong and be heard rather than dismissed. The only mirror in which the manager could see himself clearly, without the distortions of fame and flattery and fear. When that mirror shattered, what remained was a figure alone with his own reflection, and the reflection, over time, began to lie. After Taylor's departure, Nottingham Forest never again reached the heights of those extraordinary years. They remained competitive. They won the odd domestic trophy, but the continental glory did not return. Whether this was coincidence or causation, nobody can say for certain. Perhaps it does not matter. What matters is what came next. The long, slow, magnificent unraveling of a man who had lost the one partner capable of telling him the truth. On the 4th of October, 1990, Peter Taylor died. He was 62. A heart attack, sudden and final, the kind of departure that leaves no room for reconciliation, no possibility of the conversation that both parties know they need to have, but keep postponing until it is too late. Clough went to the funeral. He stood at the graveside and he wept. Not the controlled, dignified tears of a public figure performing grief for the cameras, but the raw, ugly, helpless weeping of a man who has lost something he cannot replace and knows, with terrible clarity, that the loss is partly his own fault. In his autobiography, published 4 years later, he wrote the dedication that has become, for those who knew them both, the most honest sentence Brian Clough ever committed to paper. I was nothing without him, and he knew that. 7 words. For decades he had insisted that he was the best, that he was in the top one, that Rome would have been built faster with him on the job. And yet he wrote, in the quietest possible voice, that without Peter Taylor he was nothing. Taylor had always known it, and Taylor was dead and could no longer confirm or deny or forgive or be forgiven. The cracks were widening, and through those cracks the darker chapters of this story began to emerge. In the January of 1989, Brian Clough punched 4 of his own supporters in the face, on camera, in front of 30,000 witnesses, and somehow, improbably, absurdly, the incident ended with one of the victims drinking tea in the manager's office and declaring it the finest day of his life. The context involved a pitch invasion. Forest had beaten Queen's Park Rangers in a League Cup quarter-final, and a group of young supporters, drunk on victory and lager in roughly equal measure, spilled onto the playing surface in celebration. The boss, who regarded the pitch as his territory with the possessive intensity of a medieval lord surveying his manor, walked out to meet them. He did not ask them to leave. He grabbed the nearest fan by the ear and clipped him smartly across the head. Then the next. Then the next. Then the next. 4 young men, cuffed and clattered by a 53-year-old in a green sweatshirt, live on national television. The Football Association fined him £5,000 and banned him from the touchline. The press oscillated between outrage and delight. and the young fellow who had received the most conspicuous blow was subsequently invited into the manager's office, given a cup of tea, an apology of sorts, and a handshake. He emerged glowing. "Best day of my life," he told reporters. "Clough gave me a clip round the ear and a cuppa. What more could you want?" This was the peculiar magnetism of the man, the capacity to commit an act of indefensible behavior and transform it, through sheer force of personality, into an anecdote that the victim would treasure forever. It should not have worked. That it resulted in a cup of tea and a lifetime's worth of dinner party stories tells us something about the era, something about the culture of English football in the late 80s, and something about Brian Clough's extraordinary ability to make people forgive him for things that ought not to have been forgiven. His management style by the mid-80s had evolved into something that defied categorization, part dictatorship, part vaudeville, part group therapy conducted by someone with no formal training in any of these disciplines. Mark Crossley, the Forest goalkeeper, arrived at the club as a young professional and was immediately summoned to the office to sign his contract. He sat down. A piece of paper was pushed across the desk. "Sign that," said the boss. Crossley looked at the paper. It was blank, completely blank. Not a word, not a number, not a clause. "But there's nothing on it," he said. "Exactly," said Clough. Crossley signed. What choice did he have? The figure across the desk had won 2 European Cups. You signed the blank piece of paper because Brian Clough told you to sign it, and you trusted or feared or both that whatever he chose to write on it later would be, if not fair, then at least interesting. On another occasion, a player was subjected to a dressing room critique of unusual specificity. Clough looked at him for a long moment, the kind of silence he deployed as deliberately as other managers deployed tactical diagrams, and said, simply, "You're a jigsaw." The player blinked. "A jigsaw, gaffer." "A jigsaw. You don't fit together." He walked away. The explanation arrived the following Monday, 3 days of bewildered silence later, when the manager sat the player down and, with the patient manner of a schoolteacher addressing a slow pupil, outlined exactly which pieces of his game needed rearranging and in what order. The Mother's Day ritual became legendary among Forest players of every generation. On the Sunday nearest to Mothering Sunday, each member of the first team squad was required to telephone his mother from the manager's office. Not from home, not from the training ground payphone, from the office with the boss sitting beside them, listening. The conversations were not optional. The sincerity was not negotiable. A young player, nervous, embarrassed, acutely aware of the older man's presence, would dial the number and wait. "Hello, Mum, it's me. Yeah, I'm fine. Just ringing to say Happy Mother's Day." Clough would nod. The player would continue, stumbling through pleasantries that felt strange under observation. When the call ended, the manager would wave the next one in. Those who failed to participate discovered that the consequences were real and immediate. The principle was unwavering. You telephoned your mother on Mother's Day because Brian Clough believed that a player who neglected his mother would neglect his responsibilities on the pitch, and within the walls of the city ground, his beliefs had the force of natural law. Stuart Pearce, the England left-back whose toughness on the pitch was matched by quiet thoughtfulness off it, recalled a conversation that captured the technique in miniature. Clough fixed him with that look, interest, amusement, and the faintest suggestion of menace, and asked, "How do you think you played for England last week?" Pierce drew breath to answer. He had prepared something, a modest assessment, the kind of balanced response a professional learns to deliver when questioned about his performance. He never delivered it. Before the first word had left his mouth, Clough changed the subject. Completely, without transition. The conversation moved on, and Pierce was left holding his unspoken response like a parcel that nobody wanted to receive. It was maddening. It was bewildering. And it was, Pierce would later acknowledge, extraordinarily effective. The question was never about the answer. It was about reminding the player that the manager was watching, that the manager had an opinion, and that the manager's opinion was the only one that mattered, regardless of whether it was ever shared. The incident with Nigel Jemson was darker. Jemson, a young forward, had displeased the boss in some fashion. The specific offence is lost to the vagaries of dressing-room memory and was summoned to account for himself. The accounting took the form of a punch to the stomach, delivered without warning. Jemson doubled over. Clough walked away. Nobody intervened. Nobody reported it. And Jemson himself, telling the story years later, did so with a half-laugh and a shake of the head, as though describing a natural disaster rather than an assault, something that happened to you like weather, beyond the control of any individual. Where is the line between forceful leadership and abuse? The question demands an answer, and this career refuses to provide one. He hit players. He intimidated them. He subjected them to psychological manipulation that would, in any other professional context, constitute grounds for dismissal. And yet his former players speak of him with an affection that borders on reverence. He was impossible, Pierce said, but he made us better than we ever dreamed we could be. This is not an exoneration. It is a fact. And facts, unlike morals, do not resolve themselves into tidy conclusions. He could not, however, make everyone forgive him for everything. The Hillsborough disaster occurred on the 15th of April, 1989, 4 months after the pitch invasion. 96 Liverpool supporters died in a crush at the Leppings Lane end of Sheffield Wednesday's ground during an FA Cup semi-final, a figure later recognised as 97 after the death of Andrew Devine in 2021, more than 3 decades after the tragedy. It was the worst disaster in the history of English football, born of police incompetence, stadium neglect, and institutional indifference to the safety of working-class supporters. In the immediate aftermath, South Yorkshire police mounted a campaign to blame the victims, planting stories about drunkenness and ticketless fans, constructing a narrative of culpability that was as false as it was cruel. Brian Clough repeated that narrative. In interviews within weeks of the disaster, in 1989, he echoed the police version, suggesting that Liverpool's supporters bore responsibility for their own deaths. He said it publicly, forcefully, with the certainty that characterized everything he said. 5 years later, in his autobiography of 1994, he wrote it down again, committing to print the claim that the fans had been killed by their own. It was wrong, factually, morally, unforgivably wrong. The Hillsborough Independent Panel, reporting in 2012, would conclusively establish that the supporters bore no responsibility whatsoever. The police had lied. The press had amplified the lies. And Brian Clough, a man who prided himself on speaking truth to power, had repeated those lies without checking whether they were true, not once, but twice, 5 years apart. In 2001, 3 years before his death, he offered an apology. "I was misinformed," he said, a sentence that managed to be simultaneously an admission of error and a deflection of blame. For many in Liverpool, it was not enough. It could never be enough. The words had been said. The book had been published. And they had been said by Brian Clough, whose words carried more weight than most, precisely because people believed him. This is the cost of credibility. When a lesser figure repeats a lie, the damage is contained. When Brian Clough repeats a lie, it becomes part of the accepted history, harder to dislodge, more widely believed, more deeply harmful. He spent his career demanding to be listened to. Hillsborough was the moment when being listened to became a curse rather than a gift. The allegations of financial impropriety surfaced publicly when Alan Sugar, the chairman of Tottenham Hotspur, stood in a courtroom and stated that Clough liked a bung. The word blunt, ugly, unmistakable, landed like a stone in a still pond. The specific allegation concerned the transfer of Teddy Sheringham from Forest to Spurs in 1992, and the claim that £58,000 had been paid to Ronnie Fenton, Clough's assistant, as an inducement. Sugar said it under oath in public, with the cameras recording every syllable. The Football Association investigated. Rick Parry, who led the inquiry, later stated, "We felt he was guilty." The charge was misconduct. The case was closed without a formal verdict on grounds of the accused's deteriorating health. When asked about the allegations, Clough responded with the kind of line that only he could deliver. "I've never had VD either," he said. The press laughed. The question was not answered. And the truth of the matter, whether Brian Clough took money he should not have taken, or whether he was the victim of boardroom politics and unreliable testimony, remains, to this day, unresolved. His contempt for Italian football was more straightforward, if no less inflammatory. It dated from 1973, when Derby were eliminated from the European Cup semi-final by Juventus in circumstances that Clough believed, with some justification, involved the corruption of match officials. He never forgave. "Cheating bastards," he called them, with a cheerful venom that suggested the wound was as fresh in 1990 as it had been in 73. He refused to speak to Italian journalists. He refused to engage in diplomatic pleasantries. He simply decided that an entire nation's footballing culture was beneath his contempt, and he maintained this position with a consistency that was, in its own perverse way, rather admirable. There is a photograph from the 92 to 93 season, Forest's last in the top flight under Clough, that those who knew him in his prime find almost unbearable to examine. The face that stares back is swollen, blotched, aged beyond its years. The eyes, once sharp and calculating, have acquired a glazed, unfocused quality. The jaw has softened. The skin has taken on the particular greyish hue that alcohol bestows upon the faces of those it is slowly killing. By the early 90s, the drinking had become impossible to conceal. The chronology of his alcoholism is not complicated, though its causes are deep and tangled. In the 60s, at Hartlepool's, he drank socially. The pubs where he collected money for the club were also the pubs where he learned to drink as working men drank, steadily, and without apparent consequence. In the 70s, the stress of Derby and Leeds and Brighton and the early years at Forest push the consumption upward. A drink after a defeat, a drink before a difficult meeting, a drink to fill the silence of an evening when the adrenaline of match day had subsided, and there was nothing left but the ticking of a clock and the ache of a knee that never properly healed. In the 80s, the plateau, functioning alcoholism disguised by success, the kind of drinking that goes unremarked because the man doing the drinking is winning trophies and appearing on television and making the nation laugh. Nobody questions a winner's habits. Nobody stages an intervention for someone who has just lifted the biggest prize in club football. And then the losses. Taylor's departure, Hillsborough, the Bungs allegations, the slow erosion of Forest's competitiveness. The results declining, the players aging, the magic fading like a signal from a distant transmitter. By the early 90s, he was drinking openly, recklessly, with the determined commitment of a man who has decided that the destination is more important than the journey, and the destination is oblivion. Barbara endured it. The word is insufficient, but no better one exists. She endured it the way she had endured everything, his absences, his rages, his fame, his failures, with a quietness that was not passivity but fortitude. He called her his rock. She did not crumble, even as the man who leaned upon her grew heavier with each passing year. One can picture an evening in the house in Quandon, not a specific evening, but the kind that must have occurred 100 times. The television is on. He sits in his chair. On the table beside him, a glass, not his first, nor his last. She brings tea. He does not touch it. She sits across from him. The silence is full of everything that has been said too many times and everything that has never been said at all. Do you want something to eat? Not hungry. There's soup. I could warm it. I said I'm not hungry. A pause, the television murmurs, the tea cools. Nigel rang. He wants to come round Sunday. Fine. He sounded well. Silence. The glass is lifted. The glass is set down. The evening continues, and nothing has been resolved, because nothing can be resolved by conversation when the problem is not a misunderstanding, but a disease that sits in the room like a third person, breathing audibly, taking up space, refusing to leave. In his books, written during these years and later, he recorded the date of his mother Sally's death incorrectly. This detail, uncovered by researchers at Unheard in 2024, is small but devastating. His own mother's death, and he could not remember or chose not to remember when it happened. Was it the alcohol eroding the architecture of memory? Was it deliberate, a conscious rewriting of the past to make it more bearable? We cannot know. But the image of a man sitting at a desk, writing about his mother, and getting the date wrong, this image contains a grief so deep that it has damaged the very faculty of remembrance. The scoreboard at Bramall Lane told the story in the bald, unfeeling language of numbers. Sheffield United 2, Nottingham Forest 0. The 26th of April, 1993. Relegation. The Premier League had been born the previous summer, a gleaming new edifice of television money and corporate ambition, and Forest had been among its founding members. And then, in the very first season, the club fell through the trapdoor and disappeared. The final whistle blew at Bramall Lane, and the mathematics that had been closing in for weeks became irrevocable. Forest were down. The side that had conquered Europe, that had beaten Malmö and Hamburg, that had made a provincial city on the Trent the centre of the footballing world, was relegated to the second tier of English football. The travelling supporters did something remarkable. They did not boo. They did not turn their backs. They did not chant for the manager's dismissal, though they had every rational justification for doing so. Instead, they sang. "Brian Clough's a football genius," they sang, and the words floated across the Sheffield pitch like a benediction, absurd, defiant, heartbreaking. They sang it because it was true. They sang it because truth does not expire when circumstances change. And they sang it because they understood, perhaps more clearly than the pundits and the boardroom analysts, that what they were witnessing was not merely the relegation of a football club, but the final act of a career that had given them the greatest years of their lives. He walked onto the pitch afterwards, 58 years old, face swollen, eyes red from tears, from drink, from exhaustion, from all three. The crowd rose. He waved. It was the wave of a man saying goodbye to the only world in which he had ever truly belonged. He left the club. Nobody offered him another job. The most successful English manager in the history of European club football walked away from the game, and the game let him go without a backwards glance. At home, the silence was deafening. Not literally. There were grandchildren by now, and telephone calls, and the ordinary domestic noises that fill any house where people continue to live. But beneath the noise there was a silence that had to do with purpose, with identity, with the question of what a man does with himself when the thing that defined him has been taken away. For 28 years, every Saturday had been structured around a football match. Every week had built towards 90 minutes of concentrated purpose. Now there was no next result. There was only the weekend, stretching out like an empty field. He wrote books during these years. The first autobiography, published in '94, was a bestseller, not because of literary merit, but because the voice was unmistakable. Even on the page, even filtered through a ghostwriter, the Clough cadence came through. Provocative, funny, self-aggrandizing, unexpectedly vulnerable. The second book, published in 2002 under the title only he could have chosen, Cloughy, Walking on Water, was more reflective, more uncertain, the voice of a man looking back and finding, alongside the triumphs, a landscape of wreckage he could not quite bring himself to survey in full. Nigel Clough, meanwhile, was building a managerial career of his own. He took charge of Burton Albion, then of Derby County, the same ground where his father's ghost walked every corridor and haunted every press conference. Nigel managed with his mother's temperament rather than his father's. Quiet, analytical, measured. He managed with competence rather than genius, with preparation rather than inspiration, and if this meant that he would never win a continental trophy, it also meant that he would never punch a player in the stomach or drink himself into a hospital ward. Simon, the eldest, and Libby, the youngest, had found lives away from the spotlight. They had inherited Barbara's need for privacy rather than their father's need for an audience, and they guarded their distance from the public gaze with a firmness that suggested long practice. A morning in Derby, a weekday, Tuesday perhaps, or Wednesday, the kind of day that has no significance. A man walks through a park with a dog on a lead and a stick in his hand. He is thinner than he used to be. His face, once fleshy with drink, has acquired the gaunt quality of late middle age and declining health. He walks slowly, not because he chooses to, but because his body no longer permits haste. A passer-by recognizes him. "Mr. Clough, is that you?" A pause, the dog pulls at the lead. Course it's me, young man. Old Big Ede's still going. Not as fast as he used to, mind, but still going. A smile. The old bravado, worn thin as tissue paper, but still present, still deployed, still capable of producing a warmth in the listener that has nothing to do with the words and everything to do with the voice. That voice, unmistakable, carrying the vowels of Middlesbrough, softened by decades of television studios, but never quite surrendered. The passerby walks on, warmer for the encounter, carrying a story he will tell that evening to his wife. I saw old Clough today, in the park, with his dog. Still the same. But he was not the same, and those who knew him well understood that the man in the park was in the final passage of a long and punishing journey. Then came the voice of a child, and everything changed. Stephen Clough, Nigel's son, Brian's grandson, was young enough to say what adults had been unable or unwilling to say for years. The boy looked at his grandfather, the famous grandfather, the brilliant grandfather, the grandfather whose name was spoken with reverence by strangers, and he said the words that no one else had managed to say with sufficient force to penetrate the armor of denial and habit and self-destruction that Brian Clough had built around himself over 30 years. Please don't die. 3 words, spoken by a child who did not understand the complexities of addiction or the psychology of self-destruction, or the long, tangled history of a knee that broke on a frozen pitch in 1962. A child who understood only that his grandfather was ill, and that illness, if left untreated, led to a place from which people did not return. Brian Clough, the man who had ignored the advice of doctors, the pleas of his wife, the concerns of his children, the evidence of his own deteriorating body, listened to his grandson. For reasons that perhaps only he could understand, he obeyed. In January of 2003, he underwent a liver transplant at the Freeman Hospital in Newcastle. The old liver, ravaged by decades of alcohol, was removed and replaced with a donor organ, a second chance, gifted by a stranger, accepted by a man who had spent years refusing to acknowledge that he needed one. He stopped drinking. The fact deserves its own sentence, because it represents, in the context of a life defined by excess, an act of discipline as remarkable as any tactical masterstroke he ever devised on the training ground. After decades, after thousands of bottles, after countless evenings in the chair with the glass on the side table and the television murmuring, he stopped. Completely. Finally. Barbara was beside him in the hospital. She was beside him during the recovery. She was beside him as he took his first tentative walks through the streets of Derby with his new liver and his old stick, thinner than he had been in years, frailer than anyone who remembered the vigorous young manager of the 70s could have imagined, but alive, present, sober. He had 18 months. 18 months of clarity after decades of fog. 18 months in which to walk the streets, to greet the strangers who recognized him, to sit with Barbara in the garden and watch the light change across the lawn. 18 months in which to be a grandfather, a father, a husband, roles that had always been subordinate to the more public role of football manager. The cruelty, when it arrived, was absolute. The new liver functioned. The alcoholism was conquered. And then the doctors found cancer. Stomach cancer, inoperable, untreatable, terminal. The body that had survived the destruction of a knee and the destruction of a liver could not survive this final assault. The irony was savage. He had beaten the disease he had inflicted upon himself, only to be defeated by a disease that arrived uninvited, with the random malice of a universe that does not concern itself with fairness. The months narrowed. The walks grew shorter. The stick bore more weight. The 20th of September, 2004. A Saturday. The house in Quarndon, with its green lawn and its quiet street, and its shelves of trophies and opera programs and family photographs. Barbara was there. Simon was there. Nigel was there. Libby was there. The family gathered as families gather around the centre that is about to give way. Brian Clough died at home, aged 69, of stomach cancer. The loudest voice in English football left the world in silence, surrounded by the people who had loved him longest and known him best, the people for whom he was not a legend or a controversy or a punchline, but a husband, a father, a flawed and irreplaceable human being. The reaction was immediate and immense. The BBC interrupted its programming. The newspapers cleared their front pages. At the City Ground in Nottingham and at Pride Park in Derby, supporters of both clubs, rivals whose enmity was deep and genuine, arrived with flowers and scarves and stood together in the communal silence of shared grief. The scarves of the two sides, red and white, were tied together on the railings of both grounds, knotted in tribute to the only man who could have united those divided loyalties. Peter Shilton wept on camera. Stuart Pearce could not speak. On one of the scarves, someone had written in marker pen, in handwriting that was careful but unsteady, the handwriting of someone who was crying while they wrote, 7 words that said everything the obituaries and the tributes and the television specials would spend days trying to articulate. The best manager England never had. He had won 2 European Cups. He had won the First Division Championship. He had transformed 2 provincial clubs into the finest teams in the country, and one of them into the finest on the continent. And he had never, not once, not for a single match, managed the England national team. The reasons were well understood. He was too difficult, too outspoken, too unpredictable, too fond of a drink. Too northern, too working class, too much of everything that the Football Association, with its blazers and its committees, and its instinctive preference for men who did not make waves, found uncomfortable. They wanted someone manageable. Brian Clough was many things, but manageable was not among them. And so the greatest English manager of his generation, perhaps of any generation, never managed England. And on the 20th of September, when it was too late to correct the omission, the entire country paused to mourn him, and everyone said what everyone had always known. He should have had the job. He deserved the job. He would have been magnificent. They were right. And they were too late. And that, perhaps, is the most English thing about this entire English story. She had survived everything, and she died on a hospital car park. Barbara Clough had lived through 45 years beside a man who filled every room he entered, every stadium he stood in, every newspaper page that carried his name. She had watched him conquer Europe twice, watched him fall from the Premier League, watched the bottles multiply and the apologies come too late. She had never sought the spotlight, never given an interview, never written a book, never sold a single story. In all those 45 years together, no tabloid ever printed a whisper of another woman, no rumour ever surfaced, no scandal of that kind ever touched the family. For a man of his fame and fire in that era, it was almost miraculous. He had been, in his own loud and imperfect way, a one-woman man. When he died in September 2004, She simply continued, as she always had, quietly, steadily, the rock he had once called her. 9 years of widowhood followed. 9 years in the house in Quandon where the trophy replicas still stood on the shelf beside opera programs and family photographs. The telephone rarely rang with requests for comment. She never answered them anyway. No memoir appeared. No documentary crew was admitted through the door. She kept the private world she had always protected, the world of ballet and Tchaikovsky, and the quiet routines that had sustained her when the noise outside became too loud. In 2013, she went to the Royal Derby Hospital for treatment for cancer. She fell in the car park. The injury to her head was sudden and final. There was no grand last scene, no poetic symmetry, no moment that could be shaped into a neat closing line for the cameras. She died from the consequences of that ordinary fall on ordinary asphalt. The woman who had outlasted the drinking, the scandals, the public storms, the private silences, taken by something as simple and merciless as a slip on wet concrete. There was no justice in it. There was no poetry, just the end. And with Barbara's death, the innermost circle closed. The woman who had held the center of the Clough family, silently, firmly, without asking for recognition, was gone. The children were left to carry the name on their own terms. Simon, the eldest, remained private. He had lived his adult life at a careful distance from the spotlight, and he maintained that distance after both parents were gone, guarding his memories with the same quiet determination his mother had shown. Libby, the youngest, did the same. They had grown up in the eye of a storm, and they had chosen, as adults, to live in calmer weather. That choice was their right, and the world, for the most part, respected it. Nigel kept managing. Of the 3 children, he alone had followed his father into football, first as a player of genuine quality, then as a manager of steady competence. He had played for Forest under his father's management, which meant enduring the unique torment of being the boss's son in a dressing room where the boss was Brian Clough. Every goal he scored was attributed to favoritism. Every mistake was magnified. Every selection was questioned. He bore it with a resilience that was more Barbara than Brian, quiet where his father was loud, measured where his father was impulsive, patient where his father would have exploded. As a manager, he took Burton Albion from non-league obscurity into the Football League, a feat of sustained, unglamorous determination that echoed, in its own modest way, his father's early work at Hartlepool's. Then came Derby County. The symbolism was unavoidable. The son walking into the same ground where the father had won the championship, sitting in the same office, facing the same local press, carrying the same surname. Every press conference invited comparison. Every result was measured not against the achievements of other Derby managers, but against the impossible standard set by Brian Clough in 1972. Nigel bore this too. He managed Derby for 4 years, was sacked in 2013, and moved on to Sheffield United, to Burton again, to Mansfield Town, without bitterness and without drama. He was not his father. He had never tried to be. And the football world, eventually, learned to judge him on his own terms rather than his father's. The memorials remain. In Nottingham's Old Market Square stands a bronze statue of Brian Clough, arms outstretched, as though he is still embracing the city he made famous. The sculptor captured something essential in the pose, the openness, the confidence, the suggestion that the arms are wide enough to hold an entire community. Supporters pause beside it. Tourists photograph it. Children, who were not born when he was alive, sit at its base and are told by parents and grandparents about the night a team from Nottingham won the European Cup and then won it again. In Derby at Pride Park, another statue, the same figure, the same open arms, the same bronze certainty. It stands near the ground where he won the championship, where he fought with the board, where he thrust 2 fingers at the cameras and walked away. 2 cities, 2 statues, 1 man. At the City ground, the Brian Clough stand bears his name in white letters against a red background. Every home match, 20,000 supporters file past those letters without looking up, because they do not need to. The name is part of the ground now, part of the brickwork, part of the air. And linking the 2 cities is Brian Clough Way, the A52, renamed in his honour, the road that joins Nottingham and Derby across the flat Midlands countryside. It is an ordinary dual carriageway, busy with lorries and commuters, unremarkable in every physical respect. But the name on the signs transforms it into something else, a permanent reminder that these 2 rival cities share a single debt, a single memory, a single extraordinary man who gave both of them the best years they have ever known. On match days the scarves still appear, red and white knotted together on the railings, as they were on the day he died, as they will be for as long as anyone remembers. The old songs are still sung. The voice that once rattled dressing rooms and press conferences and television studios is gone, but the echo refuses to fade. It hangs in the air above the Trent, drifts across the terraces, settles in the memories of those who heard it and in the imagination of those who did not. Craig Bromfield, one of the 2 Sunderland boys Clough had taken in during the 80s, spoke about the experience in a Sky Sports interview in 2021, more than 3 decades after the car door opened on a street in Sunderland, and a voice said, "Get in." People remember him as a manager, Craig said. I remember him as the man who gave me a bed, food, and the belief that I was worth something. Nobody asked him to do it. He just saw 2 lads on the street and decided it couldn't go on like that. Craig later wrote a book about the experience, a testament of gratitude to someone the world knew as a tyrant of dressing rooms, but whom he knew as a second father. He had arrived at the Clough household at 16, destitute and without hope. He left it 4 years later with something that no football trophy could provide, the knowledge that he mattered, that someone had looked at him and seen not a problem but a person. Without him, Craig said, I'd be dead or in prison. There is no statistic for this. No trophy is awarded for saving a boy's life. But if the measure of a person is not what he achieved in public, but what he did when nobody was watching, then this, the car door, the bed, the meals, the years of quiet, unglamorous, unpublicized care, may be the finest thing Brian Clough ever did. The circle closes where it began. On Boxing Day 1962, a knee snapped on a frozen pitch at Roker Park, and a playing career ended in the time it takes for bone to break. Everything that followed, the management, the trophies, the scandals, the drinking, the redemption, the final silence, grew from that single fracture. The boy who failed the 11+, who was told he was not clever enough, proved that cleverness wears many faces. The striker who was told he would never play again became the best manager England never had. The husband who drank too much and stayed out too late and let the bottles pile up beside the chair was also the husband who called his wife his rock, and never, in 45 years, gave her reason to doubt his faithfulness. The father who was absent for 1,000 bedtimes was also the father who made his players telephone their mothers on Mother's Day, because he understood in his bones that the debts we owe to the women who raise us can never be fully repaid. He once said, and this is the only time the line appears in this story, because some things should be said once and allowed to stand, "I'm not saying I'm the best manager in the business, but I'm in the top one." He was not joking, and he was not wrong, and now the silence. The silence in the house in Quandon, where the television no longer murmurs, and the glass no longer clinks against the side table. The silence on the terraces after the final whistle, when the floodlights dim and the last supporters file through the turnstiles into the dark. The silence that settles like dust, when the loudest voice in any room is no longer there to fill it. But silence, in football, is never permanent. It lasts only until the referee raises the whistle to his lips and blows for kick-off. And then the noise begins again, the roar of the crowd, the thud of boot on ball, the shout of a manager on the touchline urging his players forward, demanding more, insisting that they are better than they know, that the impossible is merely the untried, that a parish church choir can walk onto the stage at La Scala and sing the house down if only they believe. Brian Clough believed. He believed when nobody else did. He believed when the evidence was against him, when the odds were impossible, when the world told him he was too loud, too difficult, too northern, too working class, too much. He was too much. He was always too much. And English football has never found anyone to replace him. The floodlights are dimming. The crowd is going home. But on every pitch where a boy still dreams of scoring the winner, and on every touchline where a manager still dares to believe he can build something impossible from nothing, the echo of that unmistakable Middlesbrough voice lingers. Sharp, warm, infuriating, tender, alive. Brian Clough is gone. The story he wrote is not.